the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
This is a reading from the 15th chapter of Mark's Gospel. When the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you abandoned me? Some of the bystanders hearing it said, Behold, he is calling Elijah. And one ran, filling a sponge full of vinegar, put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see if Elijah comes and takes him down. Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. When the centurion who stood facing him saw that he breathed his last, he said, Truly this man was the Son of God. After my first year at Bruté, my vocation director assigned me to work at Sharing Meadows. It's a camp for adults who suffer from physical and mental disabilities. And we had anybody from 18 years of age to, we had an 81-year-old. And the degree of disability was different for each camper. Some were pretty high functioning and were able to do a lot of things. And some were pretty severely disabled. And we had to help with like bathing and changing diapers and cleaning up after using the restroom and things like that. And I remember before I went, I was dreading it. I didn't want to go. I had no sort of background or familiarity with this type of work. I was uncomfortable, and in short, I was vulnerable. But I went, and the first week I was there, after I got there, I didn't want to be there. I mean, it was the same. Thoughts of, what am I doing? Why am I here? But about midway through that first week, one of the other counselors, Tony, came up to me and said, Adam, I need your help changing Brian's diaper. So Brian was a 33-year-old man who had cerebral palsy. He had never walked a day in his life. He was confined to a wheelchair. His arms, whenever you'd see him, his arms were permanently in front of him like this. And because of his condition, his legs and his feet were curled, and they crossed one another. So I went and I helped Tony. As I was reading this passage from Mark's Gospel, I think it's a very intimate and powerful example of Jesus' willingness to be vulnerable with each one of us. It gives us deep insight into who he is. And so in this reflection, in your mind, keep the thought, do I recognize Jesus as a person who has feelings? Do I recognize Jesus as a person who experiences emotion? Intimacy and vulnerability are very powerful things. They're beautiful things. But they're also delicate and can be frightening. And so, as I'm reading this passage and I'm faced with Jesus and his vulnerability and other passages in the gospel, sometimes I don't know what to do with that. And so I kind of avoid it. So when I was initially looking at this passage, okay, my God, why have you abandoned me? And I thought, well, Jesus is the Word made flesh, right? And he's the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and the first line of the 22nd Psalm is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so I thought, Jesus is drawing the connection, that he's this fulfillment. And so he really didn't feel abandoned. I mean, he's Jesus. Or another example is the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And we see Jesus pleading with his Father, if there's anything at all possible for me not to have to endure this, please let it happen. But not my will, but yours be done. And I think, well, Jesus knew that this was going to happen. I mean, he predicted it 3 times on his way to Jerusalem. And all of them, he sounded pretty confident. And, at the end of the day, he's God, right? So he has the strength, he has the courage to do it. This is just like a formality, just something that he said to relate to us, to make us feel better. In all those instances, I'm not giving Jesus the space or the room to authentically feel. Because he does. If we truly believe what the church teaches about Jesus being fully God and fully man, then Jesus does experience fear, sadness. Going into the garden, he told the apostles, "My soul is sad." That's a deep level of emotion. And then abandonment. Am I willing to accept the fact that Jesus feels forgotten, left behind, and abandoned by the Father who, up to this point, in his teaching, in his ministry, in his miracles, seems so present? Since Pope Francis was elected, the phrase that I hear a lot is about encountering. And we have to meet people where they're at, which is true, absolutely. But I think when faced with this passage, it's fair to ask the question, am I willing to meet Jesus where he's at? Even if that means the cross. Am I willing to sit with Jesus in his feeling of abandonment, in his feeling of discomfort? Can I see that sometimes in the moments where I feel alone, or when I feel sadness, or I feel abandonment, that maybe it's not so much mine, but Jesus extending an invitation for me to share in his? And I think if we engage that, and we embrace that, powerful things happen. And it shows in this passage from Mark, in regards to the centurion. The striking thing that I saw was, it says, when the centurion who stood facing Jesus. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, well, if there was a man who had been beaten and whipped and then hung on a tree, I'm sure there were people present who weren't necessarily staring at it. It's a pretty brutal image. But this man was willing to stand in that place and look at Jesus, to engage Jesus in that moment. And when he did that, that was when he was able to recognize Jesus for who he was, the Son of God. So if we're able to be present to Jesus, to embrace that vulnerability that he offers each one of us, and share our vulnerability with him, we can gain a deeper insight into who Jesus is and who he's inviting us to be as well. So I went with Tony to help Brian change Brian's diaper, and in my mind I was freaking out. It was all my fears realized. I mean, it was just like touching a nerve. It was touching my vulnerability right at the core. So we went in the room and we had to pick Brian up off of his chair, and we had to lay him on the bed. And so we laid him down, and then I went to get a new diaper to change him. And so when I turned back, I handed the new diaper to Tony, and when I looked at Brian, for the first time, his arms were no longer like this. When we had laid him on the bed, his arms had branched out like this. And I was thinking about it, and his legs from his condition were curled so that his body looked like this. And he had a trachea. He struggled to breathe. And so there was this man, this 33-year-old man, his arms outstretched, his legs curled, and he was struggling to breathe from his condition. And it was in that moment that I realized what I was doing there. I realized that I was encountering Jesus in his moment of vulnerability, and he was encountering me in mine. And it was very powerful. And so, Tony, the other counselor, helped get him back in the chair, and we took him out to the rest of the group. And I sat in that room and I cried for 15 minutes. And it was tears, sure, of some sadness, but it was just of an encounter of love and an encounter of intimacy between myself and our Lord. Ultimately, the question is, Jesus feels abandoned by his Father. Is he going to feel abandoned by us as well?